الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. So we are at the third point. Imam Iqbal is discussing the unique characteristics of mystic experience and how it's different from and similar to normal day-to-day experience. And the third point to note is that to the mystic, the mystic state is a moment of intimate association with the unique other self. So there is a mystic and there is intimate association with the unique other self. And this other self is transcending, encompassing, and momentarily suppressing the private personality of the subject of experience. So it's trying to describe mystic experience So this experience, mystic experience, so you have a mystic self, which is experiencing. And there's the other self, probably Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this other self is transcending, it transcends grasp of this and other mystic selves. So they might have a glimpse of it, but they can't encompass it. They can't fully grasp it, or even start to grasp it. إلا ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء. And it is encompassing this self. This self is encompassing in the sense that it encircles, or it overwhelms, or it is, what's the word? Arabic word would be muhit. It encompasses everything, but nothing encompasses it or can encompass it. So in that sense, it's transcending. And when you experience this other self, this unique self, yourself is overwhelmed by this self. Or probably it's better to say that even the tajalliyat, the glimpses of this self. So this is the meaning. Obviously, we can't really understand this unless someone has glimpse of this experience he is talking about. So for that we need to read the literature, and the literature, Sufi literature especially, which describes these experiences, and in Quran and Sunnah as well, with our hadith describe the nearness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Islamic position on this is that Allah subhanahu to what we understand from the Quran and Sunnah and the literature is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the one hand is beyond the grasp of any creature. On the other hand, so la yuhituna bi shay'in min ilmi illa bima sha. But there's a illa bima sha, except whatever he wills. So there's a possibility of nearness. Taqarrub ila Allah. That's taqarrub ila Allah. That's what intimate association is, and its height is in namaz or salat, for example. Okay, so the third point to note is that the mystic state. State is state. Mean think of state as hall, probably. Mystic state. So the third point to note is that to the mystic state is a moment of intimate association with the unique other self, transcending, encompassing, and momentarily suppressing the private personality of the subjective experience. That we can see it in some of the description of how the revelation used to come to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in the later experiences of Sufia and ulama. So there's the intimate association, but with the self. So that qurb, or intimate association, can be basically a gift of that self, because without that, this self, which is nothing in reality to the other self, and if this self is anything, it is because of that self. That's why it's impossible to have this intimate association, because if we look at it conceptually, intimate association and transcendence are two different, mutually exclusive things. And that's why it's very hard to comprehend the relationship between this subjective relationship between this self and the other self. Because on the one hand, there's a possibility of qurb, which is intimate association, and it has its maratib, or its hierarchy. But on the other hand, this association can only be purely a gift from the other self, because that other self is beyond you, essentially beyond you. Yeah. Okay. So considering its content, the mystic state is highly objective, like it's real. It cannot be regarded as mere retirement in the midst of pure subjectivity. But that objectivity comes because it is a gift. It is not gift of the real self to this self. But there's always a possibility that some of these experiences are not the real experiences. So there's always a question of error in understanding as well as grasping the true nature of this experience, if you want to call it experience. But you will ask me how immediate experience of God as an independent other is at all possible. The mere fact that the mystic state is passive does not finally prove the veritable otherness of the self experience. The mere fact that the mystic state is passive, that the mystic is receiving, does not prove the veritable otherness of the self experience. Doesn't it? The mere fact that the mystic state is passive does not. So if it is really passive, then it can't be doubted that it's coming from beyond that self. Otherwise, by definition, it's not passive. But that beyond is real or not is the other question. Or even if it is real, it is the real which we are thinking of, so whether it's God or angels or other sort of creatures. So that's an open question, and that's how the error intrudes into these experiences. This question arises in the mind because we assume without criticism that our knowledge of the external world through sense perception is the type of all knowledge. Yeah. So presumably in this sort of mystic experience, sense perception is overwhelmed by some other form of experience. But what that other form of experience is not entirely clear. So when the self is overwhelmed or passive, it means that it's passive in the sense that. But in sense experience, a self is passive too, even though once it receives the data, then it processes it actively. So at that stage, it is not passive. So passivity is also part and parcel of sense experience. Anyway, if there was so, we could never be sure of the reality of our own self. Sorry. This question arises in the mind because we assume without criticism that our knowledge of the external world through sense is the type of all knowledge. Okay, if this were so, if the sense experience was the only type of experience, we could never have sure of the reality of our own sense, because presumably our knowledge of our own self is not based on sense perception. And many philosophers think that, but what about inner sense experience, inner experience? Obviously, Hume said that, when we introspect, we don't find any self, and Kant, in a sense, agreed with him to a point. But if sense perception is not the way to our own self, what is? What is it? But Allama Iqbal is presenting this prospect here to sort of argue that sense perception is not the only form of experience. However, in reply to it, I suggest the analogy of the daily social experience. How do we know other mind in our social intercourse? It is obvious that we know our own self and nature by inner reflection. Okay, so that would be, and sense perception respectively. Nature. We possess no sense for the experience of other mind. Inference. That would be a Lockean position, I guess, inference. The other would be empathy. The third position would be the mind is not something, you know, uh, like a brain in a vat, but it's more like what the whole body and what you perceive is the other mind. Anyway, the only ground of my knowledge of conscious being before me is the physical movement similar to my own, from which I infer the presence of another, not just physical. Personally, I think it's our experience of other people is at the level of experience prior to inferences. It's some sort of a direct experience, but I mean, philosophically, it's very hard to argue this case. But physical movements similar to my own, so not just physical movements, but okay. Or we may say, after Professor Royce, that our fellows are known to be real because they respond to our signal and thus constantly supply the necessary supplement to our own fragmentary meanings. So we basically experience the other through their reaction to our actions or through responding to our communication, etc. So how did we go to this? How do we know other minds? However, in reply to this, I said then also the daily experience. This was so we never shall live our own. In daily experience, we know other self through inference from their physical movements, through the signals, through. So, in a sense, we experience the other being one way or the other. So, from this, we can sort of infer that we might be able to experience the being of the being, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a unique other self. Okay, so the response, no doubt, is the test of the presence of a conscious self. Response to your call, for example, the Quran also takes the same view, and your Lord said, call me and I respond to your call. And namaz, for example, is described in a hadith as a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a dialogue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when my servant asked thee concerning me, then I am nigh unto them and answer the cry of him that crieth unto me. So dua or mukhul ibadah, dua in this sense is the essence of the worship. So one way we know the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through direct experience is that He responds to our cries. But obviously those experiences are subjective in a sense that there's always the possibility of error, the possibility that it might be a self-reflection or response from some other self, which we have mistakenly taken to be the unique self. So that's why revelation is something beyond objective, beyond the sense of a subjective experience, which still need to be studied, still needs to be looked at and differentiated from, normal subjective experience. Uh, even the experience of a Sufi, or the experience of a awliya Allah, experience of an ordinary Muslim, is ilham or other sort of experience. They are all subjective in a way in which revelation is not subjective. Okay, so probably we should stop here, or should we just read it anyway? Okay, let's finish it. And it is clear that whether we apply the physical criterion or the non-physical or more adequate physical criterion is the criterion that uh, since we possess no self-fulfilling experience, the only ground of my knowledge of a conscious being before me is the physical movement. So that's a physical criterion, and the response to the signal, that's the non-physical criterion. So it is clear whether we apply the physical criterion or the non-physical and more adequate criterion of Royce. I think Royce, this idealist philosopher, probably that's the Royce he's referring to. So probably the Royce I know anyway. That's an American philosopher from late 19th, early 20th century. Fairly minor figure, I think, but because obviously Allama Iqbal is impressed by pragmatists, and he already mentioned William James. Royce is a pragmatist as well, and William James himself, we can't call him. He's the father of pragmatism in a sense, but we can't call him idealist, but he was certainly influenced by Hegel as well. So anyway, it is clear whether we apply the physical criterion or the non-physical, that is response to the call, for example, and more adequate criterion Royce in either case. Our knowledge of, I don't know, does Royce have a separate criterion? I think he mentioned Professor Royce that our fellows are known to us by real because they respond to our signal. So signal is a non-physical. So thus constantly supply the necessary supplementary meanings. Okay. In either case, our knowledge of the other minds remains something like inferential only. Well, that's only if we consider mind as something boxed in brain or inside. Of course, we all have inner life and outer life, but that doesn't mean that the other self is something hidden inside the body or something. But obviously, it's a very difficult topic, so I don't want to say too much at this point. That's all we can say at this point. Yet we feel that our experience of other mind is immediate because other minds are not just the minds hidden behind the brain or so, but they are embodied in the body we are interacting with, so to speak. So yet we feel that our experience of the other mind is immediate and never entertain any doubt as to the reality of our social experience. Not never, I mean, obviously, never is a bit of exaggeration, but in normal day-to-day life, we don't. So that's why doubt is a philosophical afterthought in a sense. But obviously, the unique self we are talking about is that self is not present in any physical sense to us, at least not in the way in which we normally talk about the presence of the physical or even non-physical self. So this won't apply to that self, at least not at least not immediately. I don't. I do not have a mean that at the present stage of our inquiry to build on the implications of our knowledge of other mind an idealistic argument in favor of the reality of a comprehensive self or Zat Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All that I mean to suggest is that the immediacy of our experience in the mystics is not without a parallel. It has some sort of resemblance to our normal experience and probably belongs to the same category. So, I mean, one of the things he has been doing is to emphasize continuity of so-called mystical experience with our daily experience, despite, acknowledging the obvious differences. So what he's trying to establish is that, we shouldn't consider mystic experience as something totally different from our ordinary experience, and probably we can build on our ordinary experience and on the disciplines which study our ordinary experiences like psychology to understand more fully and in a scientific way the reality of mystic experience. Anyway, we can stop here, I think. Thank you.